let's say, for example, you invested $100,000 into my startup and you're asking for 10% um, equity. Let's say on the second round, I got a million for another 10%. But doesn't that mean that your 100,000 now became a million because I've got a million for the 10%? So you should be feeling good about it. The founder should be feeling good about it. No?
Just to flesh that out a little bit. In that scenario, you're saying that the first investor put 100,000 in, later a second investor put a million in. They both
Mm,
got 10%.
mm,
And after the second investor came in, you're saying that the first investor still owns 10% of the company, right?
mm. Yeah,
Because he put $100,000 in.
yeah.
That's not technically how it works unless that investor has some very special, anti-dilution rights, which
Okay.
I would argue against. So what you would do, every deal that comes in, you have to look at pre-money and post-money. So
Hmm.
not to get too complicated, but in the first deal, what we essentially said without saying it was, my company before the first investor came in is worth $900,000. After the first investor
Mm,
comes in and puts $100,000 in, it's now worth $1 million because it was worth 900 plus 100 in cash. That's a million. So that's why he
mm.
gets 10%. So to
Got
look
it.
at the second investor, when the second investor comes in and you say, we'll give you 10% for $1 million investment, what you're really saying is that the pre-money value of that company was $9 million. And there's a
Mm,
lot of ways to get there, but it's $9 million. The second investor puts $1 million in. He now owns 10% because 1 million is 10% of 10 million. 10 million is the
mm.
total of 9 plus 1.
Yeah.
And so that's the post money, the pre money and post money of that deal. Well, what
Mm,
happens is that 9 million was spread out between the prior founders and the first investor, right?
mm.
At 90% and 10%. And everybody in that next round, unless there are special rights, everybody gets diluted by 10%. So the first owner who had 10% of the company drops to 9, and the
Nine.
founders who had 90% of the company will drop to 81%. And
Mm,
totaling 81 plus 9 is 90%, which is why there's 10% left over. So everybody should get diluted
mm.
unless you've got special provisions. And that's where these what you call dirt.
And what about ratchets then?
Ratchets are just some of the language around how you
Hmm.
how you evaluate anti-dilution, right? So there's
Mm,
different. You can do weighted averages. You can do ratchets, and so you put clauses in there to say how you do that. What I would say though is for anybody who's doing this, if you're getting into ratchets and the details of anti-dilution, you probably need to be speaking with an attorney. Your deal is getting
indeed.
more complex than
Mm,
what you should be dealing with, and so what your listeners should strive for is not to ever have anti-dilution clauses in their in
in
their
their term sheets.
in their term sheet, because that's where you could see that if so going back to the example we had before, we said after the second investment you have the new investor that owns 10%, you have the original investor that owns 9, and then you have the founders that own 81. Well, if
Mm,
that first investor had anti-dilution, this is a small change, but over time it accumulates. You would have 10% and 10% and 80%. So the
for
founders
the
dropped from
founders.
81 to 80.
80.
Guess what? That
Got
doesn't
it.
that doesn't feel like a bad deal, does it?
Mm,
But when you come in and you say, okay, now we got the valuation of the company is 20 million, but we need 10 million
mm,
to really, because we've nailed it, we've scaled it, we got our product market fit, we're going to the moon with this, right? We're ready
mm,
to really scale fast, and we're going to be a unicorn or whatever. Well,
mm,
when you take that next $10 million investment, well, and if the first investor keeps his 10%, he normally would have been diluted, by another 2/3. So should have been down to 9 and then down to 6. Well, he didn't drop at all because he had anti-dilution, right? And if you did that
mm.
with the second investor and he stayed at 10, you've now got 20% of your company that's captured with anti-dilution. And guess who takes all the dilution? The
Founders.
founders. The
Yeah.
founders go from what was 81 to, I probably should be able to do this in my head, I think it's 54%, right?
Mm,
So instead of being at 54%, they're now going to be something much lower. That might be 40% because they took
yeah.
all the dilution themselves. And you can see how round after round after round, which nobody plans on this.
Yeah.
but you get into trouble, your company goes through a downturn, the economy, external factors happen, and you're like, we really need this money. We just have to take these terms.
Mm.
And guess what? A sly investor sees that, and they'll put these things in there. They say, well, if you need my money, it's more risk for me, and that's probably true. And so I need extra terms. But that's how you end up with over a series of several rounds, founders who essentially end up with 3% of a company that they started and founded. And
Indeed, indeed.
honestly, that's better than perhaps than some of the issues that I've seen. I recently heard, and this wasn't necessarily a term sheet issue per se, but it was the result of a merger of two law practices,
Mm.
and the one of the law practices has the founder of the law practice, 5 or 10 years in, merged with other partners who came in, and then they've together grown the business. And it turns out that just recently I heard that law practice founder has been kicked out of his own firm because he lost control.
Mm.
I don't know the terms of it. This is just kind of secondhand knowledge, but he's been kicked out, and we hear about that with founders all the time. Some founders end up with
Mm.
nothing. Some founders just get booted. They're like, hey, you don't have enough control as either a shareholder or a board member anymore to stay in your company. We now have the control. We're going to make
Mm.
the decision. The decision is you're not a part of it anymore.